Hello there. This is somewhat of a part 2 to my previous video, Humans Are Not Equal, The Dishonest History of Race. You don't need to watch that video in order to fully understand this one, but it might give you a little more context as to the historical instances of racism. Now, before I delve into what modern race realists believe, there are a few things I'd like to draw your attention to. When you delve into the muddy waters of these race realists, something that I don't encourage, you'll notice a lot of strange terminology as to what they call themselves. It started off with scientific racism, the original, oh boy, it's scientific, but that quickly fell out of favor as they admit to being racists too readily. They then moved on to race realism, which is sort of like, I'm not a racist, I'm a realist, but they also realized that mentioning race at all isn't helping their cause, and finally settled on the incredibly sneaky human biodiversity. Whenever you encounter one of their scientific sources, and I'm using that term loosely, you'll quickly see the term human biodiversity. Remember, this is just a dog whistle for their usual racist nonsense. Secondly, the discussion around race is entirely silly because these racists keep abandoning their arguments for ever more abstract, vague ones. Their strategy is one of constant retreat. State some outrageous pseudo-fact, usually with no nuance or with gross misrepresentation, be proven wrong, and then retreat to a more abstract position. Examples include the whites have larger brains argument, a strange and incorrect one to make, especially since it's based on false pretenses. Once they're proven wrong, they retreat to a more abstract position where they fumble with even stranger arguments. Actually, this part of the brain has a negligent amount of gray matter more in white people than black people, an argument that ignores environmental factors, neuroplasticity, etc., etc. Which is also proven wrong, and what follows is another retreat to another position with, for example, specific appeals to genes and correlates with IQ, and so on and so forth. At some point, the discussion becomes so abstract that not only whatever is being discussed, for example, one specific gene, ceases to have any relevance to their argument, but also stops being accessible to laymen completely. That's why now, due to this constant retreating, many of their arguments are based on such minuscule nonsense that you need to start consulting specialist literature in order to refute. This will be evident shortly. Thirdly, and this somewhat follows from the previous point, they either simply don't understand science or are incredibly dishonest with how they present statistics or findings. This is to be expected as the majority of the people peddling this nonsense aren't in any way educated in these fields, and it really shows, especially when they discuss, for example in my case, medicine. They follow an information dump strategy. They basically paste dozens of studies they've never read in succession to give the image that there's some sort of scientific backing to their bigotry. Usually, whenever you read one of those studies, assuming it is from a reputable peer-reviewed journal, you realize there is quite a lot of nuance that they conveniently don't mention, if they're not completely misrepresenting the study at all. Of course, they have their handful of token racists within relevant fields, but the tendency is for those people to be completely discredited and ostracized from their scientific community for their dishonesty, ineptitude, or both. Finally, these race realists love correlation. For example, later, you'll see that they try to correlate success as an African American by how much European heritage they have. Of course, this is nonsense. What they don't seem to understand is that correlation does not mean causation. Just because something lines up doesn't mean that the two variables discussed are directly or even indirectly connected. To give an example, the per capita consumption of cheese in the United States correlates up to 94% with the number of people who die by becoming tangled in their bedsheets. This doesn't mean that if you like brie a little too much, you'll end up choking yourself with a blanket that grandma knit you. Now, the main thing I'll be consulting for what modern race realists believe is this, the supposed truth about race. Now, I've seen this here and there, and the claims within are honestly very common elsewhere as well, but what made me choose it specifically is that it was shared by Brenton Tarrant, the piece of trash responsible for the recent shootings in New Zealand. Already we know that the best examples of humanity are the ones spreading this shit. Anywho, we'll take it claim by claim and see where we get. I'll refer to the image as the copy pasta from now on, as that's its intended usage. Blame my lack of creativity for not thinking of a more appropriate title. Myth number 1. Race has no biological basis. This is strange because we need to sift through a few presumptions in order to understand what these race realists are trying to say. What exactly is race? How many definitions of race are there? Is race a useful term for scientific inquiry? How many races are there to begin with? How does the science exactly show this? When people ask, is race real? It's good to ask why. What are you trying to accomplish? For example, the study cited for this point discusses the differences between 931 people from 51 populations across the world for medical purposes. This is a noble endeavor, especially when the authors don't mention race at all, and in fact solely state that it could be used to determine ancestral identity. The race realists, however, do this in order to set arbitrary lines between people in order to discriminate. The copypasta says that there are accurate ways to determine someone's ancestry, and you can discern certain clusters that apparently could be considered races. Then they claim that somehow Africans are separated from the rest of humanity without any sort of tangible proof. A sciencey looking graph isn't enough to prove your point, especially when you're being dishonest about what you're portraying. For example, the no continuum bit was added by the people that created the copypasta, not the original authors of the study. Every other instance of this graph online doesn't have the no continuum bit. Interestingly, when I accessed the article they referenced, this graph isn't present. Whenever I've seen the graph, the study cited is always the same, but when I get a copy of the article, it's not in there. I don't know what that's about. Nevertheless, let's look into it. First of all, as the copypasta says, yes, we can indeed figure out ancestry from DNA. Now, what goes unexplained is how, just because some populations cluster together, they somehow suddenly become races. Before we actually take a look at the science behind this, let's just use common sense. The scale we're working on is already incredibly small, as you may guess, so we know that these supposed differences are minuscule at best. Hell, the usual breakup of races is 5 according to race realists, but here we only see 3 clusters, supposedly, European, Asian, and African. If we're being honest, why isn't there a separate Oceanian race? Why aren't Middle Easterners and Central Asians considered different races? Why are we breaking up the clusters into races to begin with? Just because some points cluster together on one corner of the graph, you'll draw an arbitrary circle around it and call it a race? Why do those divisions have to align with your presupposed idea of what this or that race should be? If you want to play around with it, you could magnify the differences with even more details, hence also making sciencey looking graphs where the gaps between populations grow even larger. In fact, you could look a little deeper and you'd find groups with clear delineations and clustering within relatively homogeneous populations like those in Ireland or in France. Why stop at 5 races at all? Why not have over 300, as that is even more supported by the evidence? The 5-race breakdown is nothing but a convenient, politically biased breakdown that is done solely because the race realists want there to be 5 races. The claim that races really do exist based on genetic sampling of geographically distant populations is dishonest at best. These samples appear to show clustering into distinct groups by gene variants, also known as alleles. But sampling geographically distant parts of a continuum and ignoring the regions between the samples can provide apparent clustering that does not actually prove the existence of discrete groups. There are virtually no sharp boundaries, either with physical features or with patterns of genetic diversity, that show where one population ends and the next one begins. Also, because the division of mankind into races is a political project for these race realists, they aren't very honest even with their terms. They want to divide white and everything else, and then claim real substantive differences that would then lead into political goals like no immigration or no miscegenation, which is interracial marriages, or even... The problem is that they rely on loose associations of people when they mean race, rather than definitive characteristics that are homogeneous within and heterogeneous between. Hell, they don't even use just one definition of race in their own copypasta. Also, the very study they cite disproves their claim. As it says, these results, however, say nothing about the origin and distribution of human phenotypic variation. Together, these results reaffirm that within population variation accounts for most of the genetic diversity in humans, meaning that the most genetic variability in human beings exists within groups, not between them. In more concrete terms, when you compare 2 unrelated Congolese people, and those same 2 Congolese with some random white guy, there will be more genetic diversity between the 2 Congolese than between either Congolese person and the white guy. In the end though, all this is not necessary to say since the entire argument doesn't make sense. What's unclear is what this has to do with race as the term has been used through much of the 20th century. Just because we can find groups to be different and can reliably allot people to them is trivial. Again, the point of the theory of race was to discover large clusters of people that are principally homogeneous within and heterogeneous between, contrasting groups. Analysis into this shows that such groups do not exist in the human species. Although populations do cluster by broad geographic regions, which generally corresponds to the socially determined categories of races, the distribution of genetic variation is quasi-continuous in clinal patterns related to geography. The broad global pattern you see on cluster maps reflects the accumulation of genetic drift associated with a recent African origin of modern humans, followed by expansion out of Africa and across the rest of the globe. Also, as to the race-specific evolution and environmental pressure on humans, well, out of the 1 million shared variants within humanity, only 70, yes, 70, 0.007%, have been shown to have undergone race-specific natural selection. Which ones could those be? Well, skin color, hair texture, lactose intolerance, amongst other mostly medical variations. It's the usual things you'd expect. They're trying to divide humanity over less than 0.1%. I'll build more upon this in a bit as they rehash this argument a few more times over the next few quote-unquote myths. If you'd like to read an excellent analysis of an example of cluster research and how it's misrepresented by race realists, I've included Are Clusters Races in the pinned comment below. Myth number 2. Race is a social construct. Well, yeah, it is. Again, common sense would clear this up immediately. Sadly, common sense isn't all too common with these people. As you may have guessed, this is just a rehashing of the previous argument. They don't actually have anything to prove that race is not a social construct. Here they cite another study, then paste part of an article talking about that study to, give the impression that there's more support to this idea than there really is. Anyways, they claim that clear racial groupings exist, according to the study. Upon reading the study, however, a more discerning eye finds that all that is being said is yes, there are geographic variations amongst humans, and it is possible to say that individual X's recent ancestry shows similarities to region Y, for example. Yes, people have recognizable differences which reflect their recent geographic origin. However, this does not constitute that races are biological facts. Of course, it's possible to arbitrarily pick a set of criteria and create a set of races and then study the evidence for it, but this is just a form of circular logic. What the article is saying is that through various techniques you can identify biological variation among people, but such variation does not then validate a categorization of humans into a small group of races. It's a small but important difference. Accepting variation does not amount to races. If variation was all that was required, then Africa, the continent with the most genetic diversity, would surely constitute numerous races. The very proof that race is a social construct is the belief of these race realists that, in spite of the vast genetic diversity that could classify Africans into dozens of races, if you want to play the silly game of race classifying, they adhere to the idea that there's only a single black race. Yet again, if they truly were scientific minds only bent on discovering the truth, then they'd realize that either there is no separating humanity into races because the differences presented as evidence are so minuscule, or that, if you embraced these minuscule differences, there would be hundreds upon hundreds of races. This business of genetic clustering is misguided to begin with. Those that say that recent genetic studies have resurged the classical definition of races misrepresents the purpose of cluster analysis, which is to detect patterns in a given dataset, not determine the essential number of subdivisions in our species. An example of this error is the common interpretation of Rosenberg et al. As evidence that humans are divided into 5 genetic clusters. Evidence that humans can be divided into 5 clusters does not mean they are naturally divided, as the classical definition of race would suggest. In fact, the number of clusters necessary to describe global genetic variations has been inconsistent. Some studies report 5, like Rosenberg, and others 7, like Horander. Even when the number of clusters is consistent, their boundaries and compositions are not, and finer substructures are obscured. Also, I really shouldn't need to have to say this out loud, but it's obvious to everyone that we, as humans, judge race, the social categorization that we apply other meanings to, on what people look like. These two are white women. This woman is mixed race, while this is a black woman, right? Actually, no. The first white woman is actually 72% Arab. The second is 51% Native American. The mixed race girl is 89% African, and the black woman is 54% European. Judging someone's race off of their looks is just unreliable. To use an anecdotal example, I myself have been mistaken for being an Italian, Greek, Hispanic, Turkish, Pakistani, and Central Asian, and I'm an Iraqi Arab. Unless we did genetic testing on everyone to see where their ancestors originated from, a terrifying concept on its own, we'd base our qualifications of race on nothing more than what we see and what our social environments deem black, white, Hispanic, etc., etc. Jews and Irish people only became white in the US in the last 100 years, and Mexicans kept going back and forth between being classified as white and not. How is race not a social construct? The very existence of this copypasta proves that point. They went out of their way to find evidence that races are some innate truth of the universe, and all they could come up with isn't even a cherry-picked article. It's a misrepresentation of medical research. Even if these race realists got their silly whites-only club ethnostate, they turn on each other and start decrying the Irish, or Italians, or God knows whoever else as the new subhumans. Back to the myth. They have this little color gradient figure in which... Look, the yellow to red thing is a silly and reductionist argument that makes no sense. You see it all over, but it makes absolutely no sense. They always think they're being clever when they say, where orange ends and red begins is a subjective thing. Does that mean that colors don't exist? The reason they never actually give an answer is because they can't. We're not talking about colors here, we're talking about human beings. If at the quote-unquote very extremes we have sub-Saharan Africans, European whites, and East Asians, how would you possibly classify the unquantifiable amount of intermediates between these three populations? Why and how does one population cease to be considered African and suddenly become Caucasian or white? Either you have to then come up with many criteria for the innumerable amount of people considered mixed between these, which then invalidates the entire point of having three racial groupings, or you consider every single unique group their own race, which would then result in hundreds of races. Either way, neither option is scientifically useful, and you just out yourself as the racist that you are, wanting to arbitrarily separate people just because you feel like it. Myth 3. Race is only skin deep. This is another example of race realists not knowing what they're talking about. The copypasta says that the nervous system accounts for a big deal of variation, and apparently this is supposed to be the proof in the pudding that these people aren't classifying human beings solely on the way they look and the color of their skin. They, of course, don't mention that the variation we're looking at is already on such a small scale as to make this essentially an exercise in splitting hairs. Also, they disingenuously tried to make it look like pigmentation is the last on the list, when in fact they just cut the graph in half. What they don't seem to understand is that yes, there are variations in, for example, pituitary gland development, but these variations aren't only a measurement specifically of divergence from a certain average, but also that these variations exist in all populations and they overlap. By the way, whenever they refer to anything medical, it really irks me, because they have no idea what they're talking about. If you don't know, I'm in the medical field, and as part of med school, you'd have to do a course in embryology. You can't be a doctor without doing embryology. Now, I'd love to ask one of these race realists, face-to-face, what they think dorsoventral neural tube patterning exactly is. Actually, I can already answer that for you. They'd fumble and make bullshit up because they don't know what they're talking about. Neural tube patterning has a lot to do with the formation of, and connections to, motor neurons. Neurons connected to motor functions. Not much to do with intelligence or whatever else these racists thought nervous system development means. Of course, there are other things neural tube patterning does, I'm just trying to illustrate a point. As a matter of fact, a lot of it we still don't know the how and why 100% yet, so they're being doubly dishonest. Once for not knowing what they're talking about, and twice because the research into what they're referencing is not nearly complete. Also, human genetic variation is non-concordant, meaning that the traits we usually use to distinguish races may have no value for predicting other aspects of biology. So yeah, triply dishonest. Myth number 4. Races have more variation within them than between them. Lewontin's fallacy. Looks like someone has done some Wikipedia research. Before we start, you see that graph? Yeah, that isn't in the study they cite, or any study they cite. Also, the axes aren't labeled, so either the graph is nonsense or the person making this shit doesn't understand that in science, when illustrating a figure, you always include the axes so we know what we're looking at. By the way, when I do a reverse image search, I only find the copypasta. This graph is literally meaningless, and the text boxes were added by the guy that made the copypasta. Let's run through this one quickly. Basically, the claim is that the statement, there is more genetic diversity within human populations than between them, is not entirely true, according to the race realists. They claim the opposite, in fact, that there is more diversity between populations than within them. The idea that there is more diversity within populations than between them is called Lewontin's fallacy. Just to note, Lewontin's fallacy isn't an actual fallacy, but the title of a paper written in response to Lewontin. They just like to include the word fallacy because it makes it seem more rationally argued. These people aren't the most honest, as we've already seen. It's called that because the geneticist and evolutionary biologist Richard Lewontin found that the majority of the total genetic variation between humans, of the 0.1% of DNA that varies between individuals, 85.4% is found within populations, 8.3% of the variation is found between populations within a quote-unquote race, and only 6.3% was found to account for the racial classification. After this, he concluded that, since such racial classification is now seen to be of virtually no genetic or taxonomic significance either, no justification can be offered for its continuance. Anthony Edwards, another geneticist, correctly observed that by looking at specific places in the genome, similar markers could be identified along ethnic groupings. For example, people from one area tended to have one marker, while people from another area in the world tended to have another marker. That same Anthony Edwards disagreed and claimed that although Lewontin is right when examining the frequency of different alleles, variants of a particular gene, at a single locus, the location of a particular gene, between individuals, you can still somewhat classify individuals into different populations, when you take into account the frequency of the alleles at several loci at the same time. In more concrete terms, the frequency of the alleles tend to cluster differently for different populations. What you'll quickly notice is that this was a scholarly disagreement that doesn't really bring race into account at all. Edwards never said Lewontin's data was wrong. Edward only claimed you could categorize people into certain populations based on other factors. What is being discussed is that correlations between geographical areas and genetics obviously exists in human populations, basically matching an individual with a population. What this has to do with race is, again, unclear. The mere fact that we can find groups to be different and can reliably allot people to them is trivial. It's beating a dead horse at this point, but the point of the theory of race was to discover large clusters of people that are principally homogeneous within and heterogeneous between. Lewontin's analysis shows that such groups do not exist in the human species, and Edwards' critique does not contradict that interpretation. All in all, the conversation is pointless because the very source they give proves them wrong. It doesn't say what they think it says. Basically, they haven't read the study. The proportion of human genetic variation due to differences between populations is modest, and individuals from different populations can be genetically more similar than individuals from the same population. Yet, sufficient genetic data can permit accurate classification of individuals into populations. A final complication arises when racial classifications are used as proxies for geographic ancestry. Although many concepts of race are correlated with geographic ancestry, the two are not interchangeable, and relying on racial classifications will reduce predictive power still further. The fact that, given enough genetic data, individuals can be correctly assigned to their population of origin is compatible with the observation that most human genetic variation is found within populations, not between them. It is also compatible with our findings that, even when the most distinct populations are considered and hundreds of loci are used, individuals are frequently more similar to members of other populations than to members of their own population. Thus, caution should be used when using geographic or genetic ancestry to make inferences about individual phenotypes. They haven't read the study. Even a cursory glance, just skimming through it, proves them wrong numerous times. At this point, I don't even know whether it's stupidity or dishonesty. These race realists really love this argument, as they've basically rehashed it for the 4th time now. Shame it's such a shit argument, though. There's a lot more to get to, but this video is long enough as it is. Stay tuned, as the second part of this will be uploaded in a few days, in which I'll cover the rest of the copypasta amongst a couple other things. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Sasha Novaseta, Zarian Arsin, Xiaoyan Zhang, Laurie Valdemar Minialo, Khan, Daryl McFarlane, Adrian Reynaldi, Andy Haywood, Eli Gerzon, Faustin, Henry Ashurst, Industrial Robot, Ahmad Abdi-Jabbar, Wes Franklin, Mia Nakano, Liam Sapanen, Conor O'Reilly, Brennan Ruffing, Jedi Davion, Knut Ringheim Lunde, Alonso the Red, Matt Smith, Brennan Ruffing, The Britannic, Mika Argyropoulos, Peter Coffin, Lars Utneveig, Zatarani, Kamar Pengu, and of course Charles. Thank you, Charles. I'll see you in the next one.